Constantine suddenly decided he wanted more territory to call explicitly his own. So, he demanded that Constans immediately cede all the African provinces. This request was naturally met with some pushback by young Constans, but not so much at this point that war between the two brothers was inevitable. They agreed to meet later in 338 to discuss the situation. In between coming to power and the summit with Constans, there was one matter of consequence that Constantine II weighed in on, and it has to do with our old friend Athanasius. After bursting onto the scene as a fierce anti-Arian deacon during the run-up to the Council of Nicaea, Athanasius had since succeeded Alexander to the bishopric of Alexandria, ignoring age requirements and proper electoral procedure to get there, by the way, and then he used his new powers to come down hard on those who strayed from the Nicene orthodoxy. His methods were often denounced by his enemies within the church, and by 335, he was more or less dragged in front of Constantine the Great to answer a laundry list of charges, including destruction of church property and the murder of a rival bishop. Athanasius wound up being cleared of all the charges, except for an alleged threat he had made to cut off the Egyptian grain supply to Constantinople. You can do a lot of things in this life, but the grain supply from Egypt. Constantine ordered the polarizing bishop banished to Gaul. After Constantine's death, the pro-Orthodoxy Western bishops began to petition Constantine II to allow Athanasius to return to his post in Alexandria. Seeing a golden opportunity to establish friendly relations with the Christian leadership in his provinces, Constantine II cancelled Athanasius' exile and granted his request for a return passage to Egypt. Now, the various exiles and returns from exile that this controversial bishop endured during his life, I think there were like 5 total rounds in all, would be important to document for a comprehensive history of the church, but that's not exactly what we're doing here. So the big takeaway from all of this is that we must understand how much Constantine II's decision to free Athanasius annoyed his brother Constantius II. Because Constantius was, wait for it, a staunch Arian. So just over a decade had passed since Constantine had made Christianity the religion of the emperors, and already doctrinal disputes were percolating their way up into the imperial court. Almost from the start then, Constantine's dream of one church supporting one emperor turned out to be something of a pipe dream, as rival factions within the church were now supporting rival factions within the imperial family. Each side was playing for keeps, and one side had just convinced Constantine II to let an almost certainly seditious leader loose in Constantius's, their enemy's, domain. Constantius was not at all happy about this. It's an issue that likely would have come to a head eventually, but at that particular moment Constantius was bogged down fighting an inconclusive war against the Sassanids, and Constantine II was about to find out just how little Constans was willing to be pushed around. So they didn't have time to have it out over Athanasius. In 338, the eldest and youngest of the 3 brothers met in Moesia to reassess their respective borders, and it appears that Constans, at least face-to-face, was willing to concede the issue. His older brother's rhetoric was getting mighty bellicose, so Constans agreed to hand over the African provinces to Constantine in the interest of imperial unity. At least, that's what he said. In practice, he was not going to go down that easy. For all of the rest of 338, the 2 brothers went off and defended their frontiers. Constans campaigned along the Danube against the Sarmatians, and Constantine campaigned against the Alemanni along the Rhine. But as 338 gave way to 339, the African provinces had still not been handed over to Constantine as per the agreement. Constantine complained, which prompted Constans to finally begin the administrative handover. But even then, he told his brother that the city of Carthage and most of its surrounding territory was not going to be handed over. That land, Constans announced, was henceforth to be considered a part of Italia. Now, of course, on the one hand, that makes no kind of sense. But on the other hand, it makes perfect sense. That part of the North African coast was the key supplier of grain to Italy. Giving up control of it meant giving up any hope of self-sufficiency. From a geographic point of view, arguing that Carthage was part of Italy was and is insane. But from a military and political point of view, that section of the North African coast had to be considered a part of Italy. In the ensuing back and forth, Constantine pointed out that arguing Carthage wasn't a part of Africa was insane, and Constans pointed out that he didn't really care, because he wasn't going to give up Carthage. Constantine tried to play the "I am technically still your guardian, so do what I say" card, and Constans countered with his "you know, I'm an adult now and you can't tell me what to do" card. As 339 gave way to 340, the issue had still not been resolved, and tensions were rising. Constantine eventually became so angry over Constance's stonewalling that he decided to take the ultimate step. As the eldest brother, he could only allow so much disrespect before honor and dignity required that he do something about it. With Constans busy on the Danube campaigning once again against the Sarmatians, Constantine II was ordered by dignity and honor to invade Italy. Word of the invasion reached Constans at his Dacian headquarters, and he immediately dispatched a company of his best troops to keep Constantine busy until Constans could extract himself safely from his northern campaign and come have it out with his brother in person. But there never would be any need for him to come. Shortly after invading, Constantine was running an operation near Aquileia when he was ambushed by enemy forces. In the ensuing fight, Constantine II was killed. He was 24 years old and had been in Augustus for just about 3 years. It is probably too strained an analogy to call Constantine II the Fredo of the family, but between his failure to take charge after the death of his father, to his acquiescing to a power-sharing agreement that didn't favor him, to his whining about said power-sharing agreement after the fact, and finally, to his botched invasion that led to his death, Constantine II does not really jump out and say, "I was a great leader, cut down before my time." More like, "I'm not really the equal of my brothers politically or militarily, and it was just a matter of time before something like this happened to me." Dead on the battlefield or dead in a rowboat, I think that's where Constantine II was headed from day one. In a mirror to the reaction of his brothers following the massacre of the princes, this time it was Constantius who found himself taking the news of a family member being killed off in stride. In the brutally unsentimental world Constantine's sons had been raised in, the loss of a brother was not seen as the loss of a brother, so much as the elimination of a rival. Now, the empire was neatly divided in two between Constantius and Constans, a much more satisfying state of affairs for both of them than the unwieldy five-way split that their father had left him with, and the three-way split. I have no doubt that each harbored dreams of winning sole control of the empire. But for now, each was fine to let the other have his half. Constans ruled the west, and Constantius the east. It was a power-sharing agreement that would last for a full decade, and though they came close, it was also a power-sharing agreement that never devolved into open war. In the end, it was Constance's loss of support amongst the men of the Rhine legions that did him in, rather than the machinations of his Machiavellian brother. Next week, we will push on to that fateful year of 350 AD, and watch as Constans falls, Magnentius rises, and Nepotioanus makes his adorable little bid for power. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 80,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There's no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book. Or you can keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I am going to go with a recommendation from listener Michael Stokes, and seconded by a few others, the Didius Falco Mystery Series by Lindsay Davis. Set during the reign of Vespasian, the books follow proto-detective Falco as he gets to the bottom of one crime after another from his base on the Aventine Hill. There are at least 10 books from the series on Audible, but the first is The Silver Pigs. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 141, Blood and Water. When Constantine died in 337 AD, he left the empire saddled with an unwieldy five-way power-sharing system that it appears he just sort of hoped would somehow find a way to work. Well, by 340, it had found a way to work. It found a way to work by killing off 3/5 of its members. With the number of living Augusti now down to a manageable 2, Constantius II and Constans were able to share control of the Roman Empire for a decade without butting heads with each other too much. That did not mean they were mutually supportive best friends by any stretch of the imagination, but it did mean that they mostly respected the legitimacy of the other, and as each had more than enough to deal with in their own half of the empire, it meant that they were not constantly at each other's throats. In other words, the saber rattling was kept to a minimum, and civil war was avoided. Indeed, when Constantius finally did march west to fight a civil war, it was not to take his brother out, but to avenge his death. Of course, this was not vengeance in the "you killed my brother, prepare to die" sense, so much as the allowing an illegal usurpation would set an unacceptable precedent sense, but still, the death of his brother did spur Constantius to some kind of action, which is about as nice a thing as you can say about these guys at this point in history. But before we can get into all that, we need to zip through the 340s AD, which are something of a lost decade source-wise. We know a few things, but until Ammianus Marcellinus comes along and starts to fill in the gaps, we are unfortunately left with a rather broad brush to help us paint the years of Constantius and Constance's joint rule. But like I said, we do know a few things. Both of the emperors began their newly established joint rule by doing what emperors usually do when they want to cement their legitimacy. They made war on the enemies of Rome. In the west, Constans spent most of 341 and 342 battling uncooperative Franks, and appears to have been mostly successful on those campaigns. In early 343, he abruptly abandoned the Rhine and headed north to Britannia, where he made a rare winter crossing over to the island, leading scholars to surmise that some sort of revolt had broken out that required immediate imperial attention. The revolt cannot have been too big a concern, though, because by the spring, Constans was back in Trier, keeping an eye on the Rhine. During this same period, Constantius operated almost exclusively out of Antioch, and spent most of his time fighting the Sassanid king Shapur II. As I mentioned last week, this new war between